In today's screencast, we're going to discuss the role of Eisenhower's foreign policy in the context of the Cold War. After World War II, Dwight Eisenhower is arguably one of the most, if not the most, popular men in America. He's a hero to Europeans and Americans alike, and both Republicans and Democrats love him, so he's an obvious choice to be president. And actually, both Republicans and Democrats try to get him to run on their ticket, and he ultimately decides to go with the Republicans. As a military leader and as a military hero, people thought that he might take a more hawkish perspective on the Cold War, but actually he's pretty diplomatic in a lot of ways too. So there are things that he does that don't necessarily go along with traditional Cold War policy. He does kind of make his own way during the Cold War. And one of his campaign promises was to end the Korean War quickly, and he's actually able to do that, partially by his own efforts and partially by the fortune of time and other circumstances. So 3 weeks after he wins the election, he actually travels to Korea to start the process of creating peace there. His dilemma is whether to widen the war or to withdraw, and he even had advisors presenting him with options to use nuclear weapons in Korea, which he ultimately decided not to. And as I've made the point in class several times, the United States never used nuclear weapons in war again after the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But one of the fortunate things that happened for Eisenhower is that Joseph Stalin dies. And when Stalin dies, the USSR is kind of in a period of uncertainty, and they had been supporting the Korean War. They had been supporting the communist expansion on the Korean peninsula, and now it was unclear whether or not they could continue to do that. And so Eisenhower uses this opportunity to pressure them into a peace agreement, which they actually go for. In the end, though, Eisenhower has to make some decisions about whether we are going to continue down the path of containment that Truman had started, or whether we're going to go in a different direction. And so he's got to consider who the new Soviet leader would be, how much money we are willing to spend on this fight against communism all over the whole world, whether or not containment is the best strategy, and whether or not nuclear weapons should ever be considered. So ultimately, along with his Secretary of Defense, John Foster Dulles, he comes up with a policy called the New Look, which actually strips down the Army and Navy and puts more emphasis in air power and tactical weapons, so missiles, long-range missiles and things like that. And it ends up saving the United States quite a bit of money, $4 billion per year in defense spending, which Eisenhower then wants to turn and reinvest into other programs, most notably the Federal Interstate Highway Program, which he bills as both a domestic infrastructure project and also a wartime necessity. The interstate system is actually designed to be able to evacuate large numbers of Americans in the case of a war or an attack. And it's also built for emergency purposes. There are large stretches of that highway that are straight, and they are long enough to be used as emergency airfields or emergency landing strips for military aircraft. And so instead of using a policy of limited war where Truman was putting troops in or using money or using diplomacy to try to fight communism in little ways around the world as it spread, Eisenhower and Dulles take a more aggressive tone, and they use a policy that they're going to call massive retaliation. And what that means is that we have the weapons and we have the power to be able to strike at the Soviet Union and its allies by means and at places of our choosing. It's sort of a blanket threat that's made against the Soviet Union. Basically, don't mess with the United States, don't mess with NATO, don't mess with our allies, or we will retaliate against you. But this scared a lot of people because it seemed like he was upping the rhetoric to a level that would make us more likely to go into a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, not less likely. So critics of this policy call it brinksmanship because it seems as though he's bringing us closer to the brink of nuclear war. What ends up happening is that the new leader of the Soviet Union is interesting. He's not as ruthless as Stalin. He's not as brutal as Stalin in terms of the crimes against his own people, but he's still a tough customer to deal with, and he's not going to let Russia be perceived as weak in any way. But Eisenhower tries to reach out to him and tries to open up to him, proposing that maybe what they ought to do is let each other fly spy planes over each other's countries so that they'd have a better idea of what each country had in terms of weapons, in terms of airfields, in terms of, any facilities, production facilities, that basically it would be kind of like, let me see in your backyard and I'll let you see in my backyard. And Khrushchev flatly denied it, saying that he thought it was a ploy for the United States to basically get more information on the Soviet Union. And I think he rejected it because he knew deep down inside that the Soviet Union was behind the United States in military capacity and in industrial production capabilities, and he didn't want the United States to see their vulnerability. But the Soviets do try to show their strength by testing intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, which show that they have the ability to project a nuclear weapon across the ocean and hit targets in the United States. This is the same kind of stuff that you see Kim Jong-un doing right now in North Korea. All these test missiles, all these test firings are a way to try to project strength. They're not actually targeting anyone specifically, but missile tests show the world that they are working on the technology. And the arsenal of nuclear weapons escalates dramatically during this time period. As you can see, in a 10-year period between 1955 and 1965, the United States goes from having 2,600 nuclear weapons to over 32,000. Another dimension of Eisenhower's foreign policy approach to the Cold War is to use the intelligence community that was being built after Pearl Harbor more to our advantage. So he's going to utilize spies and intelligence gathering agencies much more so than any president before him. And this is actually going to lead to the use of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, to actually conduct missions and operations overseas, not just to gather information, but to actually disrupt and overthrow governments. And so for the first time, the United States is using the CIA to conduct what are called covert operations to be able to influence the governments of foreign countries. And this included everything from trying to assassinate foreign leaders, to inciting rebellions, to doing other things to support governments that we agreed with. And the thing about this kind of a turn in foreign policy is that it's very risky. We're going to talk in a few minutes about how this can be a problem for the United States. The Eisenhower Doctrine can be boiled down to the concept that we are going to expand. We're not just going to focus on Europe anymore when it comes to supporting democracy and pro-American governments. We're actually going to start to turn our attention to the Middle East as well, especially since the Middle East is a resource-rich area which has plenty of oil, which the United States needs not only to fuel its military but its industrial machinery. And what this means is we're now expanding into a new part of the world where we're not only fighting communism, but we're also fighting against governments that are anti-American. And that means that we may actually end up having to use our military against Arab nations that don't necessarily agree with us. This is definitely not a comprehensive list, but this is a list of some of the potential covert operations that the CIA was involved with or behind during this time period. In 1953, the United States overthrew the prime minister, the democratically elected prime minister of Iran, because we viewed his attempts to nationalize oil fields as communist. And he was actually taking Iran in a position of more independence and more Iranian nationalism, breaking away from British and American petroleum companies. And the United States replaced him with somebody who was friendly to us, who would cut oil deals with the United States and with Britain. But this left a bad taste in the mouths of the Iranian people for a long, long time. This was called Operation Ajax, and it's actually the beginning of the anti-American feelings in Iran that carry over still to today. You can see some of the other ones. Guatemala, successful overthrow of the government in 1954. Indonesia, an unsuccessful attempt in 1957. Dominican Republic, a successful overthrow of government in 1960. We're going to talk in more depth about the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba in 1961. And then several attempted assassinations, some highlights of which include Patrice Lumumba, who was seen as a socialist or communist-leaning leader of the Congo. We don't actually think that the CIA pulled that plot off, and we think that political rivals actually killed him first, but we may never actually know the answer to that. And then, of course, Fidel Castro. We never liked the idea that a communist was only 90 miles away from Florida. And we had an operation that went on for several years called Operation Mongoose that tried on multiple attempts to kill Castro and ultimately failed. And then, of course, we'll talk a little bit about our support of the South Vietnamese President Diem and how, after we lost confidence in his leadership, the CIA helped local generals to overthrow him, and he was ultimately assassinated. We are meddling in a major way in the governments of other countries, and this is precisely what George Washington had warned against in his farewell address when he said we should make no permanent alliances and we should do as little as possible to interfere with the internal political workings of foreign countries. We should have open and friendly trade with them, but that's about it. By the 1950s, we are well beyond the point of no return when it comes to staying neutral in these international conflicts. And I think that this is the beginnings of the United States being seen as kind of a meddlesome country that gets involved in places that it shouldn't get involved. And so we look kind of like a bully. We're going into smaller countries, much poorer countries, and we're basically making decisions about who's going to lead those countries. And often the leaders that we choose are not the best leaders for the people in that country. So the leader that we support is not the best leader for the Iranian people. The leader that we support in South Vietnam is not the best leader for the Vietnamese people. Yet they're friendly to the United States and they're willing to do our bidding. And for that reason, we support them. But there are often long-term consequences of that, which is that the people of those countries grow to hate America or grow to blame America for all of their problems. And that's when you get the rise of anti-American feelings, hostage-taking in Iran, terrorism in the Middle East. A lot of this stuff can be traced back to these regime change policies and covert actions of the CIA during the Cold War. When Eisenhower leaves office, he gives sort of a chilling warning to the American people about something that he calls the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower is convinced by the end of his presidency that American weapons manufacturers are basically taking over, and that they're starting to influence policymakers in Congress. And he fears that if the United States economy gets too wrapped up in building weapons, that the United States is going to be more likely to go to war because it's good for business. And he warns the American public against this in his farewell speech. So I'd like you to pause the screencast at this point and take a look at the military-industrial complex speech that I've posted on Blackboard. We're going to switch gears to Cuba now. Cuba is troubling for the United States because we've been trying to contain communism from spreading, and now it's spreading to a small island only 90 miles off the shore of Florida. And so in 1958, when Fidel Castro, a young Marxist revolutionary, overthrows the government of Cuba, which is a government, the Batista government, which is friendly to the United States. There are a lot of American businesses in Cuba, hotels, restaurants, even casinos, which many are run by American mafia figureheads. There's a lot of American influence in Cuba, and Castro believes that the only way that the Cuban people can make their situation better is to basically kick out all of that foreign influence. And so Castro is going to seize American businesses, and the United States doesn't want to negotiate with him. And basically, Castro says, well, we don't want to negotiate with you either, and we're going to set our sights to someone who will actually support us, which is the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union becomes a strong ally and supporter of Cuba during this time period. Now, obviously, the United States is not going to stand for this, and we're going to start the wheels turning in the background to try to get rid of communism in Cuba. And the first step we're going to take is a CIA plot that was actually authorized by Eisenhower before he left, called the Bay of Pigs invasion. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Bay of Pigs now. The basic plan was to take people who were politically against Castro, who Castro had expelled from Cuba, many of whom were taking refuge in South Florida, to train them. The CIA was going to give them weapons and training and supplies to basically go in and make it look like they were going to overthrow Castro and that it was a native Cuban revolution, and that these guys were trying to take back Cuba from the communists. The key was that it couldn't look like the United States was involved, because if it did, A, it would look like a big country picking on a little country, and B, it might get the Soviets involved, and we couldn't risk that. So 1,500 Cuban exiles are trained by the U.S. They come in from Central America to try to overthrow the Castro government. Castro knows about it in advance and is able to defeat the army in 3 days. On the other side of this break, we'll talk about the effects of this failed attempt.